This class is actually being presented without any audience as a result of the fact that during the class at University of Southampton earlier today, we had a technical problem with the recording, and so despite the fact that we had a wonderful class with a wonderful turnout, we were left without a recording. And because we've got quite a popular following of people who are watching or listening to the class online every week, I decided to sit down when I got home for 40 minutes and represent the class. Considering that there's no one here in the room other than myself, I'm going to try and put as much enthusiasm into it as possible, but please be aware of the fact that I'm actually talking to virtual people. The topic is Chabad in the 21st century. The purpose of the class was to try and provide a little bit of understanding, perspective for Jewish students who are being serviced by Chabad in the Southeast Coast universities in Brighton, Canterbury, and Southampton, and elsewhere along the Southeast Coast, so that they can have a bit of an appreciation of what Chabad actually stands for and who Chabad really is, as opposed to the myths and confusions about what Chabad stands for and represents, which I will not go into now. Critics, I'll leave to the critics. Title is Chabad really relevant in the 21st century? Subtitle: Orthodox Judaism in liberal UK. Is there really a place for Orthodox Judaism in liberal Western Europe? And as Chabad is a branch of Orthodox Judaism, I think that the two questions go hand in hand. So we start off with speaking about Hasidism. Hasidism was founded by Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, and Chabad is a branch of Hasidism. Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov was left as an orphan at a very young age. He was born just over 300 years ago, and having been left as a very young orphan, he remembered very clearly and distinctly the final words that his father told him: do not fear anything except for God. And the Baal Shem Tov as a young boy would wander around in the forest away from his foster community, seeking, searching, trying to entertain himself, if you want. And those words that his father had left him with, do not fear anything except for God, were a guiding light for him as he traveled around, as he wandered around in the forests, trying to find some inspiration and trying to entertain himself. The Baal Shem Tov was born into a very difficult era in Eastern European Jewish history. Bogdan Khmelnytsky was a Cossack who put together a wild band of ruffians who marched across Ukraine and the region, Poland, murdering brutally thousands upon thousands of Jews. Many Jewish communities were wiped out under Bogdan Khmelnytsky only decades before the Baal Shem Tov was born. And the Jewish communities in the region were devastated by the tragedies that they had witnessed, and it took some time before the ruling classes managed to control the mobs and actually stop the terrible massacres and pogroms that were taking place. This left the Jewish community of Eastern Europe in tatters, and a very short time later, news comes from Turkey that a young man by the name of Shabtai Tzvi has declared himself as Mashiach. Originally from Eastern Europe somewhere, he had dabbled in the ideas of the Kabbalah, ended up moving out to Turkey, and somehow at some point declared himself Mashiach. He was a deranged, strange type of individual, and managed to actually garner a huge following, especially considering that Eastern European Jewry was in such tatters and such confusion. The idea that there was someone who was finally going to provide them with some hope was a very comforting thought. And many of the Jews of Eastern Europe believed that their final Mashiach had finally arrived, especially considering that in traditional Jewish teaching we know that there will be wars and perhaps even tragedies very closely followed by the coming of Mashiach. So people assumed Khmelnytsky was the tragedies and Shabtai Tzvi immediately afterwards is Mashiach. And Baal Shem Tov was born into an era of complete confusion, because what actually happened was that Shabtai Tzvi was eventually arrested by the Turkish Sultan. He was given an option: convert to Islam or execution, and he chose the former. He converted to Islam, and the result was that 10 years later he died as a gatekeeper somewhere in the Turkish palace, and the entire Eastern European Jewry was left in complete shock. If Khmelnytsky hadn't destroyed any motivation and any hope for peace for the Jewish communities, Shabtai Tzvi wiped out the last bit of confidence and knocked out, if you want, the last bit of air from Eastern European Jewry. And the Baal Shem Tov was born into this very, very difficult, dark time. That, coupled with the fact that the vast majority of Eastern European Jewry were actually completely poverty-stricken, on the bridge of starvation, on the brink of starvation, hardly any food, no income. Most people were illiterate, and actually the learned classes, the rabbis and the teachers, actually were quite indifferent to the needs of the working classes, and there seemed to be a huge disparity. The learned classes walking around dressed differently and treating the working classes in a very strange, discriminatory sort of way, and life was very, very tough for the vast majority of Eastern European Jewry. Khmelnytsky, Shabtai Tzvi, confusion, lack of meaning, lack of motivation, lack of income, lack of money, lack of food, lack of everything. And it is this era, it is into this era that the Baal Shem Tov is born, and the Baal Shem Tov feels something needs to be done. And the analogy is given of a sick prince. A prince who's lying on his deathbed almost. The king is bringing in doctor after doctor. Finally a doctor walks in and tells the king, "Your Majesty, there is actually a solution to your son's terrible ailment. He can be cured." And the king says, "Please tell me how, what? How can I save my son?" So the doctor advises the king that there's one diamond in the world that if you grind that diamond to pieces, melt it into a solution, boil it up, pour this solution down the sick prince's comatose prince's mouth, a little bit will trickle into the prince's mouth, and it has profound healing powers, and the prince will recover. So the king says, "I'm willing to do anything for the prince. Where is this diamond?" And the doctor says, "The diamond is the crown jewel in your royal crown." And the king, with no choice, commands that the diamond be taken out, melted down, dissolved into a liquid, and it is poured down the prince's throat. Now remember, the prince is comatose, so most of the liquid ends up on the bed sheets and on towels and on the floor, and a little bit enters the prince's mouth, and sure enough he has this marvelous recovery. This analogy is given to explain the Baal Shem Tov's decision to take ideas of the Kabbalah, put them into what is known as Hasidism, Hasidic philosophy, and share it with the masses. Take a diamond, esoteric teachings of the Torah that until that era, until that time, had been kept for only exclusive scholars. In fact, the Talmud says that one shouldn't study the Kabbalah until one reaches the age of 40, and that's actually not a reference just to age in passport terms, or birth certificate terms, but actually age as far as experience and knowledge in Jewish studies. And here is the Baal Shem Tov comes along, and the Baal Shem Tov says, we have no choice. The prince, Eastern European Jewry, is desperate. They are on the brink of being broken. We're witnessing the straw that is about to break the camel's back. Khmelnytsky, Shabtai Tzvi, poverty, everything else together. We need a breath of fresh air. And that breath of fresh air, the Baal Shem Tov said, was the diamond that perhaps in former generations was kept in seclusion, was kept exclusively for learned scholars. It now has to be shared with the public, even if one may argue that elements of it will become wasted and will be misunderstood, and you will end up with parts of the diamond, if you want, spilling onto sheets and towels. It needs to be done because the sick prince needs to be revived. And it is this philosophy that the Baal Shem Tov introduced, teaching these ideas and spreading the words of Hasidism. One of the major aspects in the Baal Shem Tov's life and philosophy was the value of every individual and the appreciation of the fact that there are so many Jews who have been left ignorant, discouraged, almost hopeless. And the Baal Shem Tov was determined to reach and inspire and uplift every individual he came in touch with. Even as a young man, he acted as a teacher's assistant, going through the streets, singing songs like a sort of Pied Piper, encouraging the young children to follow him to Cheder, where they would learn Aleph Beis and would learn stories of the Tanakh, stories of the Bible, and stories of the Talmud, of Gemara and the Mishnah, and be inspired. So he did that with young children as a young man, and later on he would go out into the marketplace, stand in a central location, and start encouraging the hard-working people of the market, the simple people, to come, the illiterate people, to come around them, and he would share with them and inspire them and encourage them and give them hope. And slowly but surely he formed a movement, and this idea of sharing Judaism with the ignorant masses became a major part of his followers' agenda, and they were traveling around spreading the teachings of Kabbalah/Hasidism, as well as inspiring and encouraging every individual that they could possibly come in touch with. There were, of course, antagonists who were extremely concerned and uncomfortable with the teachings of Kabbalah and Hasidism. Ironically, there are people who still refer to themselves as misnagdim, antagonists to the Hasidic movement till today, but they themselves will acknowledge that most of Orthodox Judaism incorporates a huge part of Hasidism in their philosophy today. It has become mainstream. The Baal Shem Tov also introduced a new approach to the philosophy of divine providence. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. I just want to give an idea of what the Baal Shem Tov stood for. There is a debate among the Jewish philosophers as to the definition of Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence. Is it something that relates specifically to Jews or specifically to human beings as an individual, that God relates to me on a personal level in my life? Or is it on a much broader term? And the Baal Shem Tov took it to the broadest term, and the Baal Shem Tov insisted, and throughout Hasidic philosophy this is an idea that's explained in great depth, the fact that divine providence applies to every aspect of creation, that everything happens for a reason, and everything that happens for a reason is part of the whole dynamic of creation. So when a leaf falls off a tree, it is part of the whole dynamic of everything that is going on in the whole of creation. Famous story that the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, as a young man, as a young boy, was walking with his father, and he tore a leaf off a bush or a tree, and his father criticized him and said to him, "You have just interrupted the whole dynamic of creation by interrupting the divine providence of this leaf. This leaf was there for a reason. Everything is where it is for a reason. Everything that happens is for a reason, and it is very important that we recognize," and this is a huge idea in Hasidic philosophy that the Baal Shem Tov expounded upon, this idea, and subsequent Hasidic masters have expounded upon it even more, this idea of the recognition of the fact that everything that happens in this world is for a reason, and everything is part of God's master plan. Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence. After the passing of the Baal Shem Tov, the leadership of the Hasidic movement was assumed by Reb Dov Ber, the Maggid, the preacher of Mezrich. After his passing, it was then given over to Reb Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. By this time, a movement known as the Chevraya Kadisha was formed, which basically was building an infrastructure of Hasidic masters in order to continue promoting the Baal Shem Tov's teachings across the region of Eastern Europe and ensuring that every Jew be touched by the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. The term Chavraya Kadisha, loosely translated into English, has quite a strange translation. The Holy Brotherhood doesn't sound very friendly, but that's the literal translation. Again, their goal was, they weren't a terrorist movement or anything like that, as the name might imply. They were a group of people who were building an infrastructure to ensure that there was an effective system to build the Hasidic movement across Europe, with huge success and inspiring thousands upon thousands of Jews. And by the time we were entered the beginning of the 20th century, most of Eastern Europe had been touched on some level by the Hasidic movement, and there were hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of Hasidic communities throughout Eastern Europe and Russia. So where does Chabad come in? So I've tried this 3 times this week, asking at 3 different classes, what's the difference between Chabad and Lubavitch? And I've heard all sorts of answers. Some people say that Chabad is a fantastic outreach organization, while Lubavitch is some primitive religious sect in London and New York. I've heard other arguments, so I'm going to try and give a bit of a background to what those 2 names mean. Lubavitch is actually a name of a primitive village in Belarus, and this picture is a real picture from the village. Today in the village, other than the burial sites of the 3rd and the 4th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel the Tzemach Tzedek, and the 4th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shmuel of Lubavitch, who are buried there, there's also a museum which incorporates some sort of synagogue. Otherwise, there is absolutely no Jewish life. There are a few simple farming Russians who, or Belarusians who run this little village and try and eke a living out of raising some animals and working the land. And this is actually the meaning of the name Lubavitch. It's the name of a little village in Russia. Chabad is the name of a philosophy, and I'm now going to go through, starting with Chabad and then Lubavitch, how a movement ended up with these 2 names. Chabad was founded by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. He was a disciple of Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, who we mentioned earlier, who had assumed the leadership following the passing of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the leader of the Hasidic movement after the passing of the Baal Shem Tov. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi was a disciple of Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, and when Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk emigrated to the Holy Land, then under Turkish Empire, Rabbi Shneur Zalman was appointed as the leader of the Hasidic movement in Russia. He authored 2 seminal texts, among many other teachings and texts: Tanya, which is the Bible of Chabad Hasidic philosophy, as well as a Shulchan Aruch, a code of Jewish law. There are various editions of the code of Jewish law. Rabbi Shneur Zalman's edition of the Shulchan Aruch is a very prominent, internationally acclaimed edition of the Shulchan Aruch that is studied in every circle of Orthodox Jewry today. Uniquely, Rabbi Shneur Zalman's, as opposed to most other works of the Code of Jewish Law, which are generally a fundamental text of law, which then has many footnotes around it, Rabbi Shneur Zalman in his Code of Jewish Law incorporated all the views of the footnotes within the actual text of the Shulchan Aruch. It's a brilliant work, and certainly very well recognized and a major authority. So he was both a master in the revealed aspects of Torah, as in the Shulchan Aruch, as well as in the Tanya and in the esoteric teachings of the Torah, Hasidism, Kabbalah. Lubavitch, as we said earlier, was the name of a village. Rabbi Shneur Zalman's grandson, the 3rd Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel the Tzemach Tzedek, was actually the first Rebbe of Lubavitch, because he actually moved the movement to the town of Lubavitch. Incidentally, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was named after his great-great-grandfather, Rebbe Menachem Mendel, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. And for 3 generations, Lubavitch was home to this branch of the Hasidic movement, hence the name Lubavitch. You then have 7-generation leadership, starting from Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the author of the Tanya, the founder of Chabad, going through 7-generation leadership of the Chabad Lubavitch movement as it is known today. Again, Chabad Lubavitch are both names of the same movement. What's ironic is that generally people associate Lubavitch with a bit more of a mystical, ultra-orthodox, and people are a bit wary of Lubavitch, whereas Chabad has become this fantastic open outreach movement. Ironically, as I will show soon, Lubavitch is actually the cozy, mushy community feel of the village of Lubavitch, whereas Chabad is actually a deep philosophy. The Rebbe was born in 1902. He was the 7th leader of the Chabad Lubavitch movement. He became Rebbe after the passing of his father-in-law in 1950, and he passed away in 1994, but his influence continues to guide the movement in its continuous expansion to every Jewish community on the planet. As Chief Rabbi Lau, former Chief Rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, is fond of saying that he used to think that there were places that every place that there is Coca-Cola, there is Chabad, until he found out that there were places where there is no Coca-Cola, but there is Chabad. And of course, for those who are familiar with the University of Sussex Student Union boycotting agenda, you'll be aware that the University of Sussex actually has boycotted Coca-Cola, but there is a Chabad society there. So actually, the University of Sussex is one of those places where there's no Coke, but there is Chabad. All under the influence of the Rebbe's expansion of the movement based on the philosophies which we have spoken about over the last 20 minutes, and we will continue to speak about for the next 15 minutes or so. So what actually is Chabad? We've said that Lubavitch is the name of a village. Chabad is a philosophy. On this chart, you will notice that you have the Hebrew words keser, which means a crown, a reference to God's infinite Ratzon, desire. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of it right now, into the details, but below Keser or Keter is the 10 Sefirot which are spoken about in the Kabbalah. The first 3, Chochmah, Bina and Da'at, are levels of intellect, and the other 7 below that are emotions. And basically this is a structure which Chabad Hasidic philosophy explains based on the teachings of the Kabbalah, and Rabbi Shneur Zalman expands on it in great depth, and from then the subsequent 6 leaders of the Chabad have explained it in even greater depth. In every aspect of existence, starting from the ultimate existence with God Himself creating the facility for creation, beginning with Bereshit, from the very highest level of esoteric creation down to the most physical aspects of creation as we know it, there is this structure. There is the desire, the will to create. Then there is the intellectual thought process that goes into it, and then there's the emotional faculties that actually allow the expression, if you want. So the first of the 3 of intellect is Chochmah, which means wisdom, the idea, or more specifically, the conception of the idea. When you first start to think about an idea, you're first developing the idea in your mind. Rabbi Shneur Zalman is relating this idea specifically in Tanya to our relationship with God, which I will explain, but obviously he also extends it and It can be extended to every aspect of emotional faculties. That when you have, let's take the idea of our relationship with God. So one has a desire to connect. That's Keter, that's the crown, that's the Rotz and the desire. You want to connect with God, you want to have that relationship. The correct process of the godly soul's relationship with God is that you start off with Chokhmah, the conception of the idea. The very first birth of the idea that you're trying to meditate on in an effort to engage your mind and subsequently your emotions with God. The conception of the idea, Chokhmah, the first of the three words that make up Chabad. So the Ch, the Ches. Number two is Bina, knowledge, the actual thought process, developing the idea. Comprehension. You're going through the idea, you're developing the idea, you're thinking through the dynamics of it. In our relationship with God, we think about the fact that God has created the world, and we think about what that might mean. I'm not going to go into details of it now, but Chabad Hasidic philosophy gives analogies, gives examples, gives, if you want, even meditative exercises in how we can think about our relationship with God, looking at the world around us, looking at ourselves, looking at every dynamic of everything around us, in order to be able to bring this initial desire and this initial conception of the idea into a comprehension that you actually understand it. And the same thing applies with any type of knowledge. You're developing knowledge, so you've got the first flash of the idea, and then you've got the developing the idea in your mind, and it's the broad academic spectrum of the idea. And then you've got finally the third idea, da'at, understanding. And understanding does not mean I've got it, it's in my head. That understanding means that I actually take it down to my emotions, application. It's not an academic pursuit. It's an academic pursuit which subsequently has an emotional reaction as a result of the academic pursuit. I often give the example of how I have to attend, because of my work with the university, so I'm often having to attend different types of academic presentations on the Holocaust. And as a great grandson of people who lost their lives through Hitler's atrocious through Hitler, and a grandson of people who survived and had to flee from Poland and Germany in order to be able to survive, and of course Sterner's grandmother was, may she live and be well, was in Auschwitz and experience horrendous experiences. So often I sit at these academic presentations, and then the talk finishes and everyone goes out for tea, and I'm left sitting in my seat wondering what just happened. How can you look at it in an academic perspective? Academia is a mathematical calculation, a scientific analysis, but not something so emotional and so emotive. So the truth is that academia is supposed to be exactly that. You go through this academic experience, but it's supposed to have an emotive result. It's supposed to affect your emotions. The emotions are chesed, kindness, gevura, strength, assertiveness, etc., etc. You've got seven different levels. I'm not going to go into them now, but basically Chabad is the idea of processing intellectual information in order that it then affects your emotions. Specifically in our relationship with God, it's about meditative process that brings out an Ahavat Hashem, love of God, and Yirat Hashem, or fear of God. That is what Chabad is. So basically what we're left with is the realization that Chabad is actually an intense meditation based on a deep philosophy. Lubavitch is a cozy village. So it's actually the name Chabad, generally associated with the coziness and openness of Chabad internationally. Ironically, Chabad is the name of the philosophy, Lubavitch more the outreach, openness, if you want. I doubt that my colleague Rabbi Reuven Lee will ever watch this, but if I could just mention it anyway, he's a Chabad rabbi in Cambridge. He recently commissioned a graphic designer to work on the rebranding of his organization in Cambridge, and they came up with a tag name for Chabad of Cambridge: shared wisdom. And to me, that's brilliant. That's Chabad Lubavitch. Lubavitch is about sharing. It's about the philosophies that the Baal Shem Tov taught, about the openness, about the sharing, about the love of another human being, the openness, the expansion that the Rebbe paved the way for in reaching every Jew on the planet, which we will come to shortly. But it's about wisdom. It's about sharing wisdom. Chabad Lubavitch, shared wisdom. I think that's a brilliant name, and it actually expresses everything about what these two different words, Chabad and Lubavitch, actually mean. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi walks in. I know I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent now. I'm doing this for a reason. I'm trying to give across a point. Hopefully we won't go too much over the 40 minutes. Rabbi Shneur Zalman walks into his study hall one day in Liozhne, in the town that he lived, even though he's referred to as Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and he says, "Gentlemen, you got to live with the times." Everyone thought, what? Rabbi Shneur Zalman? He opposes Napoleon because he's scared that emancipation will cause such a tremendous assimilation that Jews will completely forget their identity. And yet he's the antagonist to Napoleon, the antagonist towards emancipation, the antagonist towards modernity, is declaring live with the times. His brother-in-law comes into the synagogue and he says, "Gentlemen, chill out, don't worry." He means you need to live with the weekly Torah portion. A brilliant idea. Live with the times. You're studying a text. You open the book of Bereshit, as we're doing at the moment. You're reading Genesis, you're reading creation, you're reading Adam and Eve, you're reading Noah, flood. You're reading the birth of Abraham, Abraham's experiences, his relationship with God, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, etc., the Exodus, Moses, and everything that we study about through the entire Torah. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, you cannot read it as a historical narrative. It must be read and lived with. When you're studying the text of the Torah, this week's Torah portion, you need to live with it. You need to breathe it. You need to experience it. In other words, a fundamental idea in Chabad philosophy, which Rabbi Shneur Zalman taught, and the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, took it and expounded on it and revolutionized it in an unbelievable way, is to make Judaism relevant and contemporary. So when you read something that happened 3,500, 4,000 years ago, you need to understand how that relates to the challenges that you are going to face today. The Rebbe for many decades would analyze on a Shabbos afternoon a comment of Rashi on a text of that week's Torah portion. And the Rebbe would spend significant amount of time asking questions, tearing to pieces, if you want, Rashi's comment, in order to rebuild Rashi's comment with absolute clarity. And anyone who studies the Rebbe's analysis of Rashi realizes that the Rebbe's approach to the study of Rashi is absolutely phenomenal, in the Rebbe's understanding that Rashi was determined to explain the literal meaning of the text. And the Rebbe takes many of Rashi's comments and says, how on earth is this explaining the literal meaning of the text? And the Rebbe will then take you on a roller coaster ride of an academic analysis in order to show you how Rashi's comment is actually the interpretation, the literal interpretation of the text. Fantastic scholarly works. And at the end of every one of these talks, for decades, hundreds and hundreds of such talks, the Rebbe finished off every single one of those talks with a practical lesson in our personal lives. Because every comment of Rashi, and every verse in the Torah, And every bit of analysis that you will find through our sages, through the Jewish history, through Jewish scholarship for the last 3,500 years, with the Mishnah, with the Talmud, with the Gaonim, with the Jewish philosophy and Jewish codifiers, and every single element of it has to trickle down in an emotional level to my personal life, making it relevant and contemporary. And this is something that the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, declared, live with the times, and it's something that the Rebbe revolutionized in an unbelievable way. Apparently, I don't know how accurate the actual. I heard this from somebody who knows how to embellish a story, but the concept, I believe, is accurate. Somebody once asked the Rebbe if he's a liberal or a conservative. So the Rebbe said, "What's the definition of a liberal?" The definition of a liberal is someone who wakes up in the morning and says, "Yesterday's morals and values have no place today. Every single day, I have to reassess. We need to be progressive. Yesterday was fine for yesterday. Today, we have to reassess." So that's the definition of a liberal. Says the Rebbe, I'm not a liberal. I don't continuously update and continuously reassess and check out yesterday's values and morals and decide on new ones and adopt new ones today, which I know tomorrow may not apply anymore. I don't take that approach. Neither am I a conservative. A conservative is someone who believes that the values of 100 years ago are unchanging. I'm stuck in that I believe that the values that were important yesterday are important today. So there's no updating, there's no modernity. Says the Rebbe, I'm neither liberal nor conservative. So what am I? A Torah Jew. What does that mean? Well, what is Torah? Torah is God's infinite wisdom, as transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai. Every aspect of Torah is a tiny part, and this is actually an idea which Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, explains in chapter 5 of Tanya. Every aspect of Torah is a tiny drop of God's infinite wisdom. And we have the opportunity to study God's infinite wisdom. And because it's God's infinite wisdom, it transcends time and place, because God is infinite. Past, present, and future is all the same to God, and therefore, in His wisdom as well, past, present, and future is all the same. And therefore, the Torah is not restricted to a specific era. The Torah is not specific to the generation that stood at Mount Sinai. Torah is ever-ending and everlasting, infinite for all time, because that's the definition of Torah, God's infinite wisdom. And therefore, says the Rebbe, I'm not a liberal or a conservative, I'm a Torah Jew. In other words, I relate God's infinite wisdom to my personal life today. And tomorrow, I will relate it to my personal experience that I will experience tomorrow. It's the same unchanging Torah that changes continuously while it doesn't change, because it's infinite. And therefore it has the ability to relate to every circumstance and every background and every experience while being unchanging at the same time. Another major idea in Chabad, which many people see as a huge controversial aspect, is who is a Jew. Mi Yehudi. A major issue in Israel in the 70s and 80s, when Israel was defining the law of the right of return, and the Rebbe went on a huge campaign that the definition of a Jew should be one who is halachically Jewish because one's mother is Jewish, or one who converted according to halacha. And a lot of people seem to be under the impression that this is a very controversial approach, and a very unhelpful approach, and a very political approach. Actually, I want to argue now that the Rebbe was actually coming from a completely different perspective. The Rebbe was concerned that if you redefine what is a Jew, that would undermine the Rebbe's whole goal and the Rebbe's whole agenda. What do I mean? Very simple. Are you a Jew because of your actions, or because of default? Are you a Jew because of your level of observance, or how you feel, or your interests, your level of action, practice, or because you feel very mushy and cozy drinking chicken soup and eating matzo balls that taste exactly like grandma's? Or are you Jewish because that's who you are by definition, by default? You are the grandson or the great grandson or a great grandson of an unbroken chain of Jewish mothers, and therefore you are Jewish by default, and no one can take that away from you. And the Rebbe insisted the definition of a Jew is not someone's observance, someone's action, someone's practice. It's by default. It's your birthright, it's your identity, it's your heritage, whether you like it or not, and whether anyone else likes it or not. I know this is a recording. I don't think Christopher Hitchens will ever listen to this, but if his grandmother was Jewish, he's as Jewish as Moses. Why do I say this is actually not really a political aspect with regard to Israel, but it's actually part of the Rebbe's agenda? The Rebbe launched a mitzvah campaign. The Rebbe was determined, as somebody put it very aptly, to hunt down every Jew in love. That was the Rebbe's response to Hitler's hunting down Jews in hate. And post-Holocaust, the Rebbe wanted to find every single Jew and tell that Jew, you are as Jewish as me. You may be apathetic. Your grandparents may have been apathetic. You may have been lost in assimilation for generations. But if you are in an unbroken chain of Jew, and therefore you are defined as a Jew according to Jewish law, you are entitled to participate in the mitzvah campaign. And you are entitled to participate in Jewish life, just like Moses, and just like any rabbi, and just like any Orthodox Jew, or any traditional Jew. You are the same. In the famous words of a great rabbi, who couldn't speak very much English, but would take tefillin wherever he went with him. If he met a Jew, he would say, you Jew, I do, you Jew, I tefillin, you tefillin. I woke up this morning, and as a Jew, I knew it was my right to experience the mitzvah of tefillin. You as a Jew equally are entitled to exactly the same opportunity, and I want to give you this opportunity because that's who you are. I don't care how observant you are. I don't care what your background is. I don't care how many generations of assimilation you have before you. You are entitled to this opportunity just like me. It was a mitzvah campaign that has touched in the last 50 years, 60 years since the Rebbe, especially since the late 60s, early 70s, when the Rebbe formally launched the mitzvah campaign, has reached literally millions of Jews all over the world. You stand on a street corner and you shove a lulav and esrog into somebody's hands and you say, you're Jewish because your great-great-great-great-grandmother is Jewish in an unbroken chain, and therefore you are entitled to make a bracha on the lulav. Who? What? I don't care if you're Christopher Hitchens, I don't care what you believe in. You're entitled to it. If you want that opportunity, I'm willing to share it with you because that's your right. You are a Jew just like me. And that was why the Rebbe, this I'm arguing, is why the Rebbe was so determined that Israel should not lose its definition of who is a Jew. That who is a Jew should be defined according to halacha, in order that you don't end up getting so confused that you don't know that those Jews who are lost in assimilation no longer have any identity. So if for 3 generations I don't apply for a law of return because I'm not interested in it, because I'm assimilated and I have no connection with the land of Israel and I don't feel any identity with the land of Israel, does that mean that my great-great-grandchildren will not be accepted? Says the Rebbe, no, you are a Jew. You're entitled to participate in Jewish life like anyone else. At the same time, I should point out that the Rebbe also launched a campaign in the 1980s of the 7 Noachide laws. And the Rebbe was determined that every single human being should recognize their role in life and play their role in life, observing the 7 Noachide laws under the entitlement of the righteous Gentile, making the world a better place, each and every one of us, in our way. And the Rebbe was determined, based on the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and based on the teachings of the leaders of the Chabad Lubavitch movement before him, to inspire Jews, wherever they may be, under whatever circumstances they may be, through the teachings of Hasidism, to grow in their commitment and to embrace their heritage and connect. And I finish off with an interesting comparison between Noach and Abraham. When the flood came, Noach didn't debate with God. He built an ark. And when the water started coming, he got into the ark and he closed the doors. Referred to as a tzaddik in a fur coat, a righteous man, a tzaddik in pelts. A tzaddik, a righteous man in a fur coat. When it's cold in the room, you have two options. You can either turn on the heat or put on a wool coat. Noach put on the wool coat. He wasn't concerned for others. He was a great man. He deserved to be saved. But we don't refer to him as Noach Avinu, Noach our ancestor, because his life is not what we should be striving to be like. We are descendants of Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father. And Abraham our father, the Torah tells us that when he left the land of Haran, he took together with him the souls that he made in Haran. What does it mean, the souls that he made in Haran? Says Rashi straight away. You know who the souls that he made in Haran were? Those are those people that he and his wife had inspired to believe in monotheism. Abraham wasn't content with his own belief. He wasn't living in an ark. He put up a tent in the middle of the desert and he opened it up on all four sides and he said, "Come, I'll teach you. I'll share with everyone. I want everyone to have the opportunity to connect and be inspired." In the very first formal address that the Rebbe gave on the first anniversary of his father-in-law's passing on the 10th of Shabbat in 1950, the Rebbe declared in reference to Abraham, quoting the Medrash. The verse says, "Vayikra sham b'shem Hashem kol olam," and he called out there in the name of Hashem. And the Talmud says, don't read the word that he called out. Read it, vayakri, he made others call. And this was something that the Rebbe spoke about at that gathering. And the Rebbe says, Abraham's mission in life was to make others call out God's name, to recognize God, that every individual, every person who's entitled to recognize God should have that opportunity, should have that experience. And it's this lesson that the Rebbe has taught to the Chabad Lubavitch movement. And embracing technology and embracing the world around us, we use the world around us as tools in order to be able to inspire every Jew that we meet, based on the philosophy of the Baal Shem Tov and the philosophy of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, using an intense intellectual wisdom together with a wonderful community atmosphere of Lubavitch, Chabad and Lubavitch together, in order to achieve this aim of Al Tikra Vayikra Ela Vayakri. Do not be sufficient with you yourself calling out God's name, but ensure that every single individual around you grows in their relationship with God. L'chaim.